Hey, good afternoon to you. It is 4:06 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up 5 o'clock, John Levine joins us from the New York Post. We talked to him about Kamala Harris family and the crazy stuff they're raising money for now. Typical insane stuff. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Always great to have you with us. We had a big case today about free speech in the United States Supreme Court, Murthy versus Missouri, involving the Biden administration's coercion of social media companies to censor American citizens. Normal people see that and they go, that's a violation of the First Amendment. But if you're not normal, if you're Ketanji Brown Jackson, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, you see the First Amendment as being something that protects the government's rights. Here's Justice Jackson today.
So my biggest concern is that your view has the First Amendment hamstringing the government in significant ways in the most important time periods. What would you have the government do? I've heard you say a couple times that the government can post its own speech, but in my hypothetical, kids, this is not safe, don't do it, is not going to get it done. And so I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country.
Censor.
And you seem to be suggesting that that duty cannot manifest itself in the government encouraging or even pressuring platforms to take down harmful information. So can you help me? Because I'm really worried about that because you've got the First Amendment operating in an environment of threatening circumstances from the government's perspective, and you're saying that the government can't interact with the source of those problems.
Ketanji Brown Jackson says she's worried the First Amendment might prevent the government from censoring you. That actually happened today. For more on this, I want to bring in Margot Cleveland now. She's a senior legal correspondent at The Federalist and joins us on the phone. Hello, Margot.
Hey, how are you, Vince?
I'm doing well, but my jaw dropped when I heard that. I know she's a left-wing justice, but have you ever heard a justice take up that the First Amendment is designed to protect the government?
That was quite outrageous. She, of course, was saying it in the context of what I think normal Americans would be shocked and want to protect children, where there was some viral video suggesting they jump out of the window. But what struck me most about it was the last part where she said, why can't the government go when there are threatening circumstances in the government's perspective? You know what threatening circumstances in the government perspective is going to be? It's going to be Donald Trump getting reelected, so we have to squash the Hunter Biden story. It is going to be that Donald Trump is talking about a bloodbath when Joe Biden gets reelected to what's going to happen to the auto company. So she actually was, at the end of it, explaining what the consequence was if you follow her theory. The consequence will be when the government, in its perspective, sees something threatening, it then will seek to silence speech.
And the case itself is not hypothetical. These are actual harms that have already been carried out by the government against American citizens, in particular during COVID, when you had Americans expressing views that ran counter to what the government wanted them to say. The social media companies, under pressure from the government, were banishing those views. This actually happened, Margot.
Right, and not only did it happen, but it is the perfect illustration of why the government should not think its perspective trumps. The way you get to the truth is by having multiple viewpoints. And what happens when you, the government, think you know better, you end up silencing truthful speech, not just dangerous speech. So it was actually interesting from so many angles that what the justices were doing was they were posing all these very difficult circumstances, national security, children being injured. But that wasn't the case before it. And it's understandable. They want to know where the limits are of what the policy is and how is it going to apply. But we have facts here that show us in the main, what the government is going to do with this sort of power. And not just that, what the consequence is when the government thinks that its view is going to control. It ends up silencing the truthful speech, and that ends up hurting the citizens even more than what this supposed false speech would be.
Yeah, Sam Alito was strong on this today, as far as I was able to tell, which is, and he was pointing out that that the government is holding to the head of the social media companies a weapon of sorts, which is that they can regulate them potentially or inflict them with a criminal prosecution of some kind. Here's Sam Alito today during the oral arguments. Stand by. I just messed up the audio. Let me play. Here we go. Sam Alito.
Exchanged between the White House and other federal officials and Facebook in particular, but also some of the other platforms. And I see that the White House and federal officials are repeatedly saying that Facebook and the federal government should be partners. We're on the same team. Officials are demanding answers. I want an answer. I want it right away. When they're unhappy, they curse them out. There are regular meetings. There is constant pestering of Facebook and some of the other platforms, and they want to have regular meetings. And they suggest, they suggest rules that should be applied, and why don't you tell us everything that you're going to do so we can help you and we can look it over. And I thought, wow, I cannot imagine federal officials taking that approach to the print media, our representatives over there. If you did that to them, what do you think the reaction would be? And so I thought, the only reason why this is taking place is because the federal government has got Section 230 and antitrust in its pocket, and it's, to mix my metaphors, and it's got these big clubs available to it. And so it's treating Facebook and these other platforms like they're subordinates.
What he's kind of suggesting here is it's almost like a mob-style threat. That's a nice social media platform you got there. Hate to see anything bad happen to it, is basically the government's implied threat here, Margot.
Absolutely. And he did a really solid job. But I think that there's going to be a lot of education that's needed, because my kind of bottom line takeaway was there were 3 justices who saw a problem. There were 3 justices who thought, oh, this is great. And there were 3 justices who were kind of on the wrong side of understanding what the issue is here. And what I mean by that is you kept hearing the justices talk about coercion. And this isn't a question of coercion. The government has no business asking anyone to silence the speech of a third party, unless there are extreme circumstances, which in the Supreme Court jargon, there's a compelling interest, and it meets this strict scrutiny standard. And here we have to distinguish between what the justices recognize happens quite frequently. You make a call to the New York Times and say, hey, they're going to run this story. This is totally false. Don't publish it. The difference there is the government is going to the person doing the speech. The person speaking, in that case, the New York Times, they can consent, they can waive their First Amendment rights, just like you can waive your Fifth Amendment rights. But you cannot, as a social media company, say, oh, I'm not going to let these other people speak. That you don't have the right to waive their rights, and the government doesn't have the right to indirectly cause the censorship. And the problem was the Supreme Court was missing that distinction. Every justice, for the most part, kept bringing it back to this coercion standard. Now, the coercion standard, they met in this case. You saw the coercion day in and day out from that clip that you just played. But where did our country get this idea that it's okay for the government to go and say, I want you to silence Gateway Pundit. I want you to go and silence this other doctor. And to me, that was really concerning in the argument.
For sure. And we would, if it wasn't the social media companies in any other context, it'd be horrifying if we found out that the feds came in and said, hey, don't express that message. in your business, or don't allow someone else to express that message. Like, hey, how about you stay out of this? You have nothing to do with this. In fact, the First Amendment is designed to stop this conversation from happening in the first place.
Right, and that's where, if you think through the example that he was using with the newspapers, and that they would say, no, don't do that. And I think that he was right that it's partly that with social media, they have the 230 protection, they have antitrust protection, but they have another thing that's different. They are not the press. Even though you see the legacy press kind of caving on what their responsibility is. The reason the government doesn't do that to this same extent is because there still are a few journalists there who would be up in arms over it, and they wouldn't publish. Well, they wouldn't cave into the government because they are in a totally separate industry, and there is at least a historical understanding that the government doesn't come and tell them not to speak.
I will say, though, that, Margot, I'm not sure I love Sam Alito's analogy there, because the government does exert pressure on news outlets.
Right, and that's where I'm saying that my distinction is much more significant here. And the distinction here is that the news outlet, you go to that news outlet, the news outlet is more than able to decide whether to waive its own rights to speak.
Oh, I see.
And that's different than when you go to X or you go to Facebook.
Right.
And you ask them to censor someone else. And if the New York Times is going to squash the story, then you know what? The speaker can go to another place and run it. You're going to have the government to get every single one of the newspapers not to break the story in order to squash the story. So there's another incentive for that to happen.
Right.
So that's the distinction that unfortunately the justices did not seem to kind of distinguish. But then you also have the distinction that Justice Jackson was trying to, I think, make, which is sometimes the government can actually suppress speech. Not very often, though. And that's where you have to keep in mind. In those rare circumstances, let's say there is something where the government is about to launch a raid to get the leader of Hamas. Israel is about to do this, and our government knows this, and someone's going to publish it. Maybe in that case, you have a compelling interest, and that limited right, that limited government interest, allows you to push and even coerce the government to censor, the social media companies to censor speech. But we are nowhere in that type of field.
Even there, though, I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm an absolutist on the question. I could be wrong, but to the extent that a newsroom, say, would hold off on publishing information about a pending raid, they would do that as a courtesy, out of loyalty to country, not because I don't like the idea that the government would compel them not to share that information. But
right,
instead that
and you know what? We can have that debate, and that actually is a good debate to have. I actually still, as much as I keep saying that all the craziness that's been going on the last 6 years has almost turned me into a libertarian, I still cling a little bit to my conservative nature, that I do think that in some cases there is that compelling interest, and that might be it. But we are nowhere near that. And yet the justices seem to think if it's an emergency, if it's in the public interest, or as Justice Jackson said, if there are threatening circumstances in the government's perspective, none of that should matter. The government should, if they want to get on the bully pulpit and say, this speech is false, this speech is true, go ahead and say that. But they have no right, no business telling other people to silence third party speech.
And you don't. And again, finally, just to go back to the point I made earlier, it's not hypothetical. This all actually happened. Masks were not as effective as the government claimed. You had the vaccine did not stop the transmission of COVID. And the idea that it came from Wuhan seems like the most probable explanation for where the thing came from in the first place, from the lab in Wuhan. All of that was stuff that was censored at the behest of the federal government by the big social media companies, and that should never be allowed to happen again. And any system that allows it to happen again is violating the constitutional rights of American citizens and using these big companies as a cutout to do it, I think.
Absolutely. And as you said, not only did this happen, but those three examples you gave show why we need free speech and why we need the government out of it, because all that it does is it will enforce an orthodoxy, and that orthodoxy could be false. So it's exactly right. It happened in very real circumstances, and it's shocking to me, given what the reality was, that it isn't just a wake-up call to kind of reinvigorate the importance of free speech in our government. When you listen to the justices, that didn't seem to be what they took from the examples.
Man, I hope they make the right decision here. Thank you very much, Margot Cleveland, for covering it as always. Really appreciate your time today.
Hi there, Vince. Thank you for taking my call.
Yes, ma'am.
So, interestingly enough, found out last night that a post that I put on Facebook had been taken down because apparently I was trying to get likes and follows. And it turned out that particular post was the link to Senator Ron Johnson's official Rumble channel, the 4.5-hour roundtable that he did about 3 weeks ago. Everybody watched Laura Logan explain what's happened to journalists. But there were a lot of doctors and there were a lot of other high potency people from like Romania and whatnot. That was pulled across the board. I've got at least 2 other people with the same warning and the same removal.
This was an official roundtable done by a U.S. senator inside of a United States Senate office building, and
posted on his official channel.
Yes, and it was banished because Facebook, and whoever was getting to Facebook. Yeah, that's amazing. So you didn't know this until last night. All of a sudden you realize, you're like, wait, the stuff that I'm sharing, which is again literally government officials talking, is being banished by that social media company.
Yep, Facebook sent me the warning last night, and the other 2 ladies that also shared it. We all got it yesterday afternoon. It was dated for the 17th.
It's totally
the
disgusting.
day before the censorship arguments are made at SCOTUS.
Yeah, all
they
right.
pull it.
Sherry.
And of course, it's about COVID.
Of course it is. Even at this late date, they're still censoring COVID discussions. Sherry, thank you for that. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? And meanwhile, they're like, you know who the real fascist is? Donald Trump. What? You're literally banning entire lines of conversation and thought. Yeah. Hey, good afternoon to you. It is 4:36 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we are making sense of the news. Coming up, John Levine joins us from the New York Post. We'll talk Kamala Harris, who is very disliked, and what's going on with her family right now. They're raising money for another terrible cause. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Let's see. I want to take Kevin in Manassas here. He's on line 5. Kevin, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show. Hello, sir.
Hey, Vince. Good afternoon. Hey, I'm not a huge consumer of social media. I'm 52 years old, and I know a lot of people, and I recognize and respect the power that social media has, Facebook and the like. Yeah. I think I heard a poll recently that a certain number of 30 and unders get like 80% of their news, or 80% of them get their news from Facebook, which is shocking to me. But it's some ridiculous number. But anyway, my question is to the audience and the people who do consume social media. I think President Trump has Truth Social. I don't know if that's the same as Facebook. But when are conservatives going to wake up and either do one of 2 things or 3 things? Number one, get off of Facebook and go to a conservative site and put their money behind those advertisers. Two, demonetize the advertisers on Facebook to where they can't compete with their business model. Or three, Facebook is a publicly traded company. When is a conservative with big pockets just going to buy them and change the board of directors and people who make these decisions to go against and beat our Constitution? Those are the options we have. We need to take the fight to the enemy. And if people, you know what, Vince, I live by the phrase, I would fight to the death for you to say things to me that would make my blood boil. I believe in free speech. I don't care. Like the question I always have for people when it comes to free speech or the Second Amendment is who gets to decide? Who gets to decide who gets to have a gun? Well, the Constitution says that I have a right to have a gun.
Yes.
Who gets to decide what I have the right to say? Well, the Constitution says I get to decide what I have the right to say. Then I have to go through whatever the social consequences or whatever. If I say something out of line, I have to deal with that. But the government has no right to censor my speech. I get my news from WMAL because I trust you guys, all the guys on your shows, Chris Plant, you, at the morning show, Larry O'Connor. I've listened to you guys for years. I've listened since when Ben and Brian were on WMAL or whatever it was back in the day or whatever. It was Brian and somebody else or whatever. I don't know.
We had a moment where we had Brian and Brian. That's how much we liked Brian at that point.
Well, that's how long I've been listening, Vince, and I get 90% of my news from WMAL or places like your radio station that do not filter it. You give me the facts, and I'm a critical thinking person, and I figure it out for myself. I don't always agree with you. In fact, I've called times, and I've told you guys if I disagree with you, but I also call and tell you when I agree with you. But conservatives and real Americans, libertarian Americans on the Democrat independent side, these people, the left is here. This is how, when you want to know how did Nazi, and I'm not calling anybody a Nazi, but when you want to know, when you read a history book, and many people should, how did all these Germans go along with this crazy stuff the Nazis were doing? Because the government controlled them. It was say something and either go to prison or die. Many people in this country, although they say they would stand up and fight for this country, I think a lot of people more so now than in the past wouldn't do it because dying is a bad thing. That's the end. But we need to really learn to fight against the enemy here. They're trying to shut us down. Like like you brought up the COVID stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it turns out that 99% of what conservatives and people like you and other people were allowing on the air, doctors and people who knew what they were talking about, was correct. And the government, Joe Biden, and the left and the news media have never apologized.
In moments like that, Kevin, those types of things, they're clarifying, aren't they? If you ever have a moment where you think to yourself, am I on the wrong side of this? Did I get this all wrong? Am my lefty neighbors the right ones? Was I wrong about this? And then you go through an experience like that and you go, nope, I know for a fact I got this one right.
Correct. Real quick, I don't know if you ever saw the clip. It was Muriel Bowser and Fauci were in Southeast D.C., I believe, and an older black gentleman came to the door, and they were trying to convince him to get the vaccine. And I don't want to quote the man, but I love the guy because he's just like me. I'm a white guy. He's a black guy, but we're the same because we're all God's people. And I'm going to tell you this. He looked at Mayor Bowser, and he looked at Fauci, said, you know what? You guys are giving away raffle tickets to take this thing. I don't want it. Get out of here. The government tried too hard with that vaccine. People that have a street sense like me, because I grew up in the streets, we knew. I never took the vaccine. God bless you if you did. My mom did. My brother did. My father did. But I didn't take it. And I'm glad I didn't take it because I see how they try to deceive everybody. And they try to put us against each other. They try to keep everybody fighting while they're bankrupting and taking over our country and stealing our rights.
Well, Kevin,
so I've said this before. Go ahead.
Yeah, Kevin, I mean, we're not exactly a request show, but when you say things like that, I can't help. Here's the audio you're talking about, Fauci and Bowser.
So I'm not going to be lining up taking a shot on a vaccination for something that wasn't clear in the first place. And then you all create a shot in miraculous time. It takes years to create vaccination.
Well, it used to take years.
Okay, it used to.
You know how many years were invested in this approach? About 20 years of science to get us to be able to do it.
20 years is not enough. And 9 months is definitely not enough for nobody to be taking no vaccination that you all came up with.
The only reason I'm talking to you right now, as close as we are, is that I've been vaccinated.
Right.
But if it allows thousands of people like you don't get vaccinated, you're going to let this virus continue to percolate in this country and in this world.
Something like the common flu then, right?
And not
It's
like
much
the
more
common
serious than the flu.
Well, the flu kills a lot of people annually, too.
You know how many people died of the flu the last year? I mean, not this year, virtually none, but the previous year, about 20 to 30,000.
We just need more people standing up. That's all. And God bless that man. And you're right, Kevin. That was great. And we just need more.
Vince, that's my brother from another mother. I don't know the man, but me and him are brothers. We think the same. We all that man is a conservative. He doesn't know it. Maybe he votes Democrat. Maybe he doesn't vote. That man is a conservative. I guarantee you, if you ask him what he believes, he's a conservative. The Republicans, which I don't have a lot of faith in them, but God help us. We need to reach out to these other communities. And the way we do that is with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump made people money. People did better. Black people, white people, Hispanic people. Sure. Everybody did better under Trump. So, God, thank you, Vince. I love your show. Keep up God's work, man.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that. You know, Kevin started the call by asking when are conservatives going to step up, especially with some money, and tackle these big social media companies, maybe buy them. I do have some good news here. I don't know if you would consider Elon Musk reflexively a conservative, but if you're on the side of an open conversation, you're on my side. My sense is I don't agree with Elon Musk on everything. Definitely don't. But boy, I'm very pleased that he purchased Twitter and turned it into X. And he's turned it into a place where free speech can proliferate, which is good, which is very good. The left hates him for it. They despise him for it. You know, he's one of the, up until a couple years ago, he's one of the leading figures that the left liked to celebrate. Look at this guy, he's making all these electric cars. And they were willing to look the other way on all the gas he was burning for his rockets, you know, because he was a man of the left, they viewed. But the second he said, Twitter should be a place where there isn't censorship. In fact, we're going to change it. We're going to call it X. I'm going to buy it. He bought it. They call it X. They allow open conversation. The left decided to destroy him. They've done everything they can to try and impoverish him. Now, they've got a long way to go, being one of the richest people on the planet. At some point, occasionally the richest man on earth. They've got a long way to go. And he's got the resources to fight back. But, you know, you even heard from the Biden administration, Biden himself. Like, they were talking about, I got to investigate that. We may have to launch an investigation here and use the federal agencies to dig into his various companies and into him. That's not a mistake. They despise free speech. They despise it. You heard it. It was vocalized today by Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. She thinks the First Amendment is designed to protect the government, not you. Of course, it's designed to protect you from the government. They're not allowed to infringe upon your free speech rights. The Constitution didn't grant those rights. You were born with them. The Constitution merely documents that they need to be protected. That's what that is. And so this is the left's attitude here. And so on the it's funny, as a free speech platform, Twitter, X, Elon Musk has been very encouraging of people of all political perspectives to set up content. Obviously, he wants them to do that because as a capitalist principle, he can make more money if more voices are there creating content, driving advertisers, and driving revenue for his company, X, obviously. And among the people that he offered a gig to was the fired CNN host, Don Lemon. He said, Don, you got canned by CNN. Come on over here. The water's fine. Come on in. You start a show here. In fact, we'll even work with you. And Don Lemon made absurd demands in order to get a show started. I'm sorry I missed this going into the end of the week, but the New York Post had this headline. Don Lemon demanded a Tesla Cybertruck, a $5 million advance, and equity in the company X before Elon Musk canned him. Don Lemon demanded the sun, the moon, and the stars from the SpaceX boss before being unceremoniously dumped this week, says the New York Post. The ex-CNN anchor sent over an astronomical wish list to Elon Musk during contract talks to host a show on the billionaire's social media platform X, including a free Tesla Cybertruck, a $5 million upfront payment on top of an $8 million salary, an equity stake in the multi-billion-dollar company, and the right to approve any changes in X policy as it relates to news content, according to a document reviewed by the Post. The guy wanted everything. Give me control of your company, he said, for me to produce my amazing product on Twitter. Lemon, who is expected to air an interview with Musk for next week's debut episode on X, had also demanded a private jet flight to Las Vegas, a suite for him and his fiancée, and that the company pay for their day drinking and massages. Man, I've heard of making a big ask in a salary negotiation. I've never heard of anything like this. I need you to pay me millions up front and every year, and I need a car, and I need private travel, and I need a masseuse, and I need... Holy cow. I just want a couple more vacation days. Don't take that. Hey, by the way, to my bosses, I'm not being serious. We'll talk about it. But the private masseuse does sound pretty amazing, so add that to the list. But here you have Don Lemon making these absurd requests. And then he does this interview. He does an interview. He goes, Elon, can I interview you for my debut interview? I want it to be a big one. You're one of the most powerful people on the planet, definitely one of the richest. Can you do an interview with me? So he goes, sure, I'll do the interview with you. Look at this. I've got this relationship going. Elon's done an interview, for instance, with Tucker, and he's got Tucker's arrangement going. So let's do this with Don Lemon. Don does it. He screws the pooch. Don spends the whole interview antagonizing Elon Musk, treating him like garbage, misinterpreting him, doing bad faith attacks, left-wing nonsense. And so what happens? Well, after the interview, Musk goes, the company, X decides, you know what? No deal. We're not doing any arrangement with you. You can produce all the content you want. You can run it on our platform. You can monetize it. You can make money, but we're not going to have any sort of special deal with you. You'll just be like everybody else. You can express yourself. You're going to be like Vince Coglianese. You can express yourself, and if it gets out there, wonderful. And if it doesn't, too bad. Maybe you have to express something better in a different way, right? So Don Lemon is on my level in terms of what you have access to at Twitter, at X. And now we get to hear some of the audio. And first of all, you can tell immediately why Elon Musk thinks this guy's a moron. Remember, Donald Trump referred to Don Lemon as the dumbest man on television. And this is, was Trump wrong about this? Was Trump wrong? Listen to some of this audio. Here's Don Lemon, and Elon Musk has to explain to him the actual effect that illegal immigration has on electoral politics in the United States. Don Lemon, too dumb to understand it, and so Elon very gently explains it to him.
Can we talk about the Great Replacement Theory now? Some of the things that you post, the Great Replacement Theory, you claim that Democrats, President Biden's immigration plan to open up the border, you said that the president is getting, and Democrats are doing it to get more votes. But undocumented immigrants cannot vote in federal elections, so how is that possible?
Right. Well, you're conflating two things. One is Great Replacement Theory. The other is, which I don't subscribe to that. I'm simply saying that there is an incentive here. If legal immigrants, which I think have a very strong bias to, at least everything I've read, it's a very strong bias to vote Democrat. The more that come into the country, the more they're likely to vote in that direction. But it is, in my view, a simple incentive to increase voters, Democrat voters. And yeah, so the question is like how? So there's a few ways that this works. One is that when the census is done, the census is based on all people in an area, whether they are citizens or not. So if there are a concentration of people who came here illegally in a particular state or in a particular state, that state will actually then get an increased number of House seats. So the House seat apportionment is proportionate to the number of people, not the number of citizens. So the illegals overwhelmingly go to places like California and New York, and if you just look at the math.
He's right on the money. He's right on the money. And so Don Lemon's sitting there hearing all of this. And what does he do with it? Like, can he process it? Is it possible?
If you look at the apportionment with and without illegals, I believe California would lose. I believe the blue state, there would be a net loss of blue states of approximately 20 seats in the House. This also applies to the Electoral College. So you say, like, well, this also applies to electing the president, because the electoral votes are also done by apportionment the same way that House seats are done.
There's no debate about this. In fact, Donald Trump tried to add a question to the census to establish whether or not people were here illegally. The left fought him in court on that very thing. Here's Don Lemon reacting to it now with a bizarre, incoherent question.
But the reason, Elon, the Electoral College is in place is to to balance that, so that that doesn't happen.
To
So
balance all of the illegal aliens who are in the country. That's why the Electoral College is in place?
what you're saying about it is the exact opposite of the reason why the Electoral College is there. The Electoral College at this point, in our history, gives people who are in smaller states and red states much more of an influence over our elections than people who are in blue states, and the majority of the people in this country. That's what the Electoral College does. It actually does the exact opposite of what you're saying. It protects people who are in smaller states and protects people who are in red states.
This is idiotic.
The red states, because they tend to be smaller and less populous.
I think that statement is what you said is true, but what I said is also true, which is that if as is the case,
the Electoral College does give voice to smaller states. They're represented insofar as in how we count the electoral votes. But if you add people to the big blue states, New York, California, it adds Electoral College votes to their state, thus allowing them to have more control over who the president is.
A disproportionate number of legal immigrants go to blue states. They amplify the effect of a blue state vote. And the math, as I understand it, you can research this obviously very easily on there. It's pretty straightforward to research this. But my understanding is that there would be that the Democrats would lose approximately 20 seats in the House if illegals were not counted in the census, and that's also 20 less electoral votes for president. So the illegals absolutely do affect the who controls the House and who controls the presidency. It does not affect the Senate.
Everything he said was true. Everything he said was true. And Don still doesn't understand it. It's 4:54 now. Coming up, Kamala Harris and company, well, they're raising money for a terrible cause again. John Levine from the New York Post joins us to describe what it is.